Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 5 of True Crime California. I am your host Cindy, and I just want to give a shout out to everybody who has liked, rated, reviewed, followed the podcast. This has been a much better start than when we did Twisted Listers. Obviously, we have listeners coming over from there. But I've also realized that some of you just are not going to listen if I don't post it on Twisted Listers. So for some of you, for now, I will intermittently post these episodes there. But please, if you hear this on the Twisted Listers podcast, come over, follow, like, rate, review True Crime California. That is the new podcast. It's just me. Unfortunately, Diva's too busy. Maybe someday we'll start again. But for now, she's doing her thing, being a mom and working a lot. So I'm just taking this on by myself. And I'm coming at you with another California case. And I hate to say it, but this again is 1979 and 1980. The case obviously starts way earlier than that. And, this actually might be a two-parter. I know I said that about a previous case, but this one actually has about twice as much research. So I do think this might be a two-parter. So for those of you who hate two-parters, I'm sorry. For those of you who love two-parters, you're welcome. But yeah, let's just get into it. The case that I chose to cover this week and next is the Freeway Killer, one of the many men known as the Freeway Killer. The one that I chose to cover is William Bill Bonin. Now, I am going to cover this case for better or worse because I started the research and I got into it. But I can tell you, as the mother of a young boy, this was not the case to cover. This shit is fucked up and rough and really, really gnarly. And I think if I hadn't got so deep into research, I probably would have not covered this because it is tough. It's tough to hear. It's tough to read about. I'm definitely going to leave some of the crazier shit out, but just so everybody knows, this whole case is like one giant trigger warning. I mean, it's just gnarly trauma to young boys, including Bill Bonin, kind of from start to finish. So if that's not your thing, totally fair. It's also not my thing, but it is a case worth covering for sure. But it's crazy, so just be warned. So let's just get into it. William Bill Bonin was born January 8th, 1947 in Connecticut. I did want to call out that he was born the same day as David Bowie, so I feel like that was the gods or whatever, like making sure that things remained equal. They allowed a piece of shit like Bill Bonin to be born, but David Bowie was also born. So, kind of trying to even it out. He had two brothers, older brother Robert Jr., who went by Bobby, and younger brother Paul. So he was the middle brother here. Bobby, Bill, and Paul. His mother was raised by, there's no other way to put it, a child rapist who would assault her and her siblings almost nightly. And her mother did nothing to help her. Which is often the case in these homes where there is abuse like this. The other parent is either also a victim or is just not equipped emotionally, physically, financially to help the children. So it just sort of continues this really horrific abuse throughout their lives. Alice dealt with this by getting herself sent to a nunnery somehow. Like, it wasn't like she was in trouble, but she asked to go. She obviously didn't become a nun, but she did get married as soon as she was old enough so that she could get out of her father's home and escape him. Unfortunately, she chose a man who was very much like him, not in that he sexually assaulted her, but that he beat the shit out of her, to the point where when she was pregnant with Bill, she thought that she would either miscarry or that he might end up having brain damage. And this is important for later, and also, I think she was right. His father, Bill's father, Robert, went to the war and came back a completely different man. Now, he'd already been kind of a piece of shit, but at this point he became a serious alcoholic and was even more violent with Alice and with the children. As a way of coping, Alice began drinking heavily as well. Now, Robert also had a really terrible gambling problem and would repeatedly lose what little money the family had, including grocery money. At one point, he lost the family home in a bet, and they all had to move in with Alice's parents. Now, this was obviously a terrible situation considering her father, and at this point, both Alice and Robert Sr. would leave for hours on end to go gambling, go drinking. Alice was really into bingo, and they would leave the boys alone with this pedophile. Now, Bill was Grandpa's favorite, which is, as we know, very much not a good thing. He would pay him to help with work, quote unquote, but this was before Bill was even 5 years old. So I don't really know how helpful he would be. And I think in reality, we all know what was actually going on. Eventually, the family ended up getting another house. But by that time, both Bobby and Bill were serious troublemakers. And at one point, Bill ended up in a month-long reformatory school of sorts. This school was very militaristic in its approach to children. And Bill was harmed by the, quote, teachers there in the short time that he stayed. He was also picked on by older boys, but had one boy who was 13 help him out and keep him safe. Now, unfortunately, this boy ended up asking Bill to have oral sex with him. Bill was like, okay, probably because he'd already had sexual encounters with his grandfather, another man. So this is already kind of setting things weird in his brain. He doesn't really know any other way. So he's like, yeah, I guess I can do that. Now, he's 8 years old at this time. This other kid is 13. And what he said to the kid was, if I can tie your hands behind your back so I feel safe, I'll do this with you. So the older boy agreed to do this, but broke free very easily and then tied Bill up and raped him violently, both orally and anally. So after 1 month of this insanity, he's back home being beaten by his father and left with his grandfather intermittently. And in his spare time, he would skip school, pick fights with other kids, and steal, which he's acting out. Nobody is caring for him. Nobody loves him. He is only being hurt by all of the adults that he's supposed to, trust. Every single one of them is hurting him. So his parents, again, wanted to be rid of their two oldest sons, the troublemakers. They kept Paul, but they sent Bobby and Bill to a Catholic orphanage, the Franco-American school. And you can read about this school. It's crazy. And things there got really violent. The nuns working here would regularly beat the children, but would also do humiliating things like push their heads into toilets, hold their heads underwater, and make them punch a wood fence until their knuckles bled. There was also on site a Catholic priest who, I bet you can guess, sexually assaulted Bill and probably many other children during this time. So overall, just a truly horrific experience. And yet another situation where Bill has no love, no support, no safety, only abuse. He's just surrounded by horrible people who hurt him endlessly. Now, what's really weird in this situation is that the nuns said Bill did really well with this amount of structure. Everything was timed out. There was a routine. He couldn't really get into trouble, and it seemed to work for him, but still, what the fuck? So finally, his parents, who he thought had died because after they dropped him at the orphanage, they never once came to see him, picked him up and moved him into a new home. He was only about 9 years old at this time and had already had a lifetime of abuse. And also he was in this orphanage for a little over a year. At this point, his family moved closer to Alice's dad, and from 4th to 6th grade, Bill attended a new school. His fellow students noted he was weird, not like other kids, often dirty, acted strange. There's no real specifics about what the kids said about him at this time, mostly just that they had a feeling that he was off. Now, also around this time, he met a 40-year-old florist named Bert, who began raping Bill, but at least to Bill, this relationship was consensual and changed the way he viewed his sexuality. Now, obviously, a 40-year-old and a not even 10-year-old cannot be having a consensual relationship, but it was the first time that Bill had interactions with an adult who wasn't openly harming him in a way that was against his will, which is so fucked up that this is the positive moment in his life comparatively, So fucked. Also, around this time, Bill had become extremely codependent and refused to do anything without his younger brother Paul with him. Even though it turns out Bill was sexually abusing Paul, and also beating up on him like an older brother would, but he was sexually abusing him, but he was also very violent and hateful towards his brother, but also always wanted him around. So it's a really weird sort of relationship. Now we're in 1962. I think Bill's about 13, 14 years old. And his father got a job as a machinist in Downey, California. So the family moved to that area. Here, the boys continued to get in trouble, with Bill being arrested for petty theft and burglary, but somehow missing a trip to juvie. It's noted in many articles that he spent time in juvie when he was 10, but I think it may have been the orphanage that they were referring to. But we'll just say his young life, obviously he was in and out of very abusive institutions pretty much the whole time. Also during this time, when he's in like the Downey area, there were some adult neighbors who sort of like befriended the boys. And this was actually a positive interaction. They would give the two younger kids, Bill and Paul, food, and they would, try to like help them out. And they said every time they fed the brothers, they ate like ravenously, like they hadn't eaten in days. So this is just on top of everything else. There's just straight up neglect going on, like the parents do not give a shit about these fucking kids. So it's just this horrible trifecta: physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. That's all they're getting. Now at this point, Bobby was like old enough to kind of fend for himself, but we still have this kind of thing. They're all still living at home. So Bobby's beating the shit out of Bill. Bill is raping Paul. And finally, their mother, Alice, catches them in the act and forces them to sleep in separate rooms and thinks that like that's going to fix the problem. And like maybe it did. I don't know. But that's as much as this woman can do. Like that's the depth of her ability to help her children. Bill dropped out of high school in 1965 and started working with his dad in Downey. He also started bringing young boys back to his house, giving them beer and showing them pornography. And he was 19 at the time, and these kids were all like not adults, like teenagers or preteens only. His mother later said she started having nightmares about him being arrested for this, and they would often fight about it as she was afraid that he was gay. It wasn't even necessarily that he was like potentially raping children. It was just that he was gay. She was not happy about that, which is, it aligns perfectly with everything we know about her parenting. In 1966, at his mother's urging, and I think as an act of just kind of not knowing what to do with himself, Bill signed up for the Army. And he did this only after he could convince his friend to sign up with him, because he hated doing anything alone. And now Bill didn't have a lot of friends, but whoever this friend was down to get into the Army with him. So I guess it was kind of a good friend. He went to Vietnam in November 1967, and he did see combat. He was a gunner on a helicopter, and at one point he was given a commendation for saving another soldier's life by pulling him into the helicopter while it was under fire. So he actually saved someone at great risk to himself, which I will say is the only time we're going to hear anything like that about this man. Also at this time in Vietnam, he spent a lot of time with both male and female sex workers, and it was later found out that he violently raped at least 2 fellow soldiers repeatedly during their time over there while holding them at gunpoint. He came home from Vietnam and found that his girlfriend, who he had started dating to make his mother happy, had married another man. He was very angry, but more at being rejected than anything, because he probably wasn't actually interested in women. Now, I did hear that at some point he was married and he did even father a child, but this marriage was not enough to even really be mentioned most places. I think it was honestly a couple of months, and then they never talked again. So I don't know. What I do know is that being single allowed him the freedom to be his full true self. And he began the first leg of his long and horrific career as a rapist and eventually a murderer. Now, his first attack was on November 17th, 1968, when he picked up a kid in the Arcadia area, which is directly north from Downey by about, 20 miles or so. This boy, 14-year-old Billy Jones, was either waiting for a bus or walking home, and Bill stopped him for directions. He convinced this boy to get into his car to give him a ride home, but then he started asking him about sex and blowjobs. And when Billy said he wanted to get out, Bill locked the car doors and became violent. Billy begged him not to hurt him, and Bill beat him unconscious after telling him he would kill him and then sodomize his dead body. When Billy woke up, he was dropped at a bus stop and threatened. Bill then went on his way back to the South Bay area. Now, while he was unconscious, Billy was raped by Bill, and he went home and told his mother, and he and his mother reported the attack that same night. But Bill was already miles away back home near Downey. Over the next few months, 4 more attacks just like this took place. All of the victims were under 18, and thankfully, every single victim reported the attack, which is like awesome because it creates a paper trail. Although we'll see later that doesn't really matter. Also, I should note that at this time, Bill was riding around on a motorcycle, so he was only able to perpetrate these attacks when he could borrow his mother's car, because he was attacking these people in his own mother's car, which is like gross. Now, ultimately, using his mother's car is what got him caught. I mean, any car would have, but multiple witnesses saw the car, and even a few got the license plate number or part of it. So while driving one night, he picked up a 16-year-old hitchhiker and began his little pattern of horrificness, but was promptly pulled over by police who saw his mother's car and noted it matched the description given by multiple victims and witnesses. He was arrested, I think at the end of 1968, and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, crimes against nature, crimes against children, and sex perversion. So the fact that he started this in November and was caught that same year and had attacked 5 people, you can see that this is like a frenzy. This is like a very crazy, just like boom, boom, boom. And we'll see this later as well. It's noted in many places that when he was arrested, he told police that had they not pulled him over, he would have killed the boy in the car with him, which is just fucking great because, as you can guess, he was not in prison long enough to keep him from becoming a fucking serial killer. So good job, cops, right? So he goes to court. He chooses to plead guilty because there were all these living victims who were going to testify against him. And he immediately begins trying to manipulate the situation by asking for leniency and to be sent to a mental hospital instead of prison. His mother also wrote a letter asking that he be released to her. But like, yeah, right. He's doing this in your car. Like, clearly you do not have control of this person. However, he was evaluated and he was sent to a Atascadero State Mental Hospital, which is in the, like kind of between the Bay Area and Los Angeles, but like along the coast, where he was taken for treatment. Now, this is a prison hospital for sexual psychopaths. Nowadays, it's actually, I think, for all mentally ill criminals, and it's one of the most dangerous maximum security prison hospitals in the country. But at that time, I think it was just for like sexual psychopaths. And anyway, at this time, he was there for treatment, but it really did not go well. While doctors said that Bill verbalized wanting to get better, when it came time to do the work, he simply could not or would not do it. He was noted as being defensive and aggressive with people, and many inmates described him as irritating because he had a braggadocious manner. He was labeled as immature and unable to come to terms with who he was, and in fact, in one therapy session, this is crazy, when fully confronted with the reality of who he was and what he had done, Bill lost consciousness for a number of minutes. It was as though his brain refused to admit who he was, to the point of literally shutting down rather than processing the cold, hard truth about himself, which is fucking crazy. Like, I've never heard of that before. And it's just so wild that that's how hard his denial was, that it actually became like a physical denial. It was also later noted by doctors that he was most comfortable when making others feel scared, unsure, or anxious, which also comes into play later. So he was kind of doing like a preemptive strike against anybody and everybody as a way of protecting himself because, one, he was never able to protect himself as a child, and 2, all he knows is abuse and attacks and like bad. Everything is bad. So he's trying to do it first before somebody does it to him again. This also kind of plays into his needing someone around for everything he did in his life. So first it was his brother, and later we'll see he has a number of criminal associates of various involvement in his murders and rapes. So it's just a very interesting psychology. He spent a total of 9 months in the hospital, which was where he wanted to be because prison, is not good for people who rape little boys. So this was a very self-serving thing where he continued to say, I want to change. I know what I'm doing is wrong. He was sort of just saying the things that he needed to say. And the interesting thing was that the doctors all knew this. They noted it, but they kind of continued to let it play out to see if finally maybe his actions would align with what he was saying. Unfortunately, this was not the case. During this time, these 9 months, he was caught 3 times for having sex with other inmates, all of which were people who were not mentally capable of making these decisions. So he was preying on people who could not say no, who could not really process what was going on. So really, really crazy predatory behavior. Finally, after being caught a 3rd time for sodomy, he was just straight up transferred to prison. They were like, we don't want to deal with you anymore. You're not amenable to treatment. And according to doctors, like, he was barely on the line of maybe being treated from the start. So he had a lot of chances. They gave him 9 months to turn his shit around, and he obviously did not do it. Now, for whatever reason, because he's really good at manipulating the system, he ended up in Vacaville at another prison treatment type space, and again was found to make little or no progress there either. Finally, after only 5 years in these prison hospitals and prison, he was released despite showing no signs of improvement. Why, you ask? Well, because of a paperwork error, of course. Somehow he was marked as no longer being a threat to others, despite doctors saying otherwise, up to the month before he was released. And that should really tell you how broken the system is, because nobody noticed or questioned this mistake. He was released in 1974 and briefly got an apartment in Hollywood and tried to become a part of the gay community there. However, he had little to no social skills and quickly ended up back at his parents' house, just living with them and being kind of a loner. He got a job first as a bartender, then as a delivery driver, and he used this delivery driver position to start trolling the streets for boys again. September 8th, 1975 is his first post-prison attack that we know of. Now he finds 14-year-old David McVickers and picks him up while he's hitchhiking. Now in the 70s and 80s, so much of this, it's all the same kind of pattern in all of these stories. Hitchhiking is totally normal. Young kids running around all night on their own is totally normal. And this is like a really good story about, it's kind of a scary tale as to why we don't fucking do this shit anymore. Why we don't let our kids run around feral all night anymore. So he picks up 14-year-old David McVickers, and he starts asking him sexual questions. And when David tried to get out of the car, he pulled a gun on him. Bill then drove to a secluded area and pulled over, then made David touch him. He touched David. He then forced him into oral sex and then raped him while David cried and begged for his life. He said it hurt so much he thought he might die. And for some reason, this begging actually made Bill stop. He even apologized for hurting David, but then decided to keep him in the car while he masturbated, but then eventually drove David home. When he dropped him off outside of his house, he said something along the lines of, "I'll see you again," which is absolutely terrifying. David and his mother reported this to the police immediately, and meanwhile, the next day, Bill propositioned another young boy who told him no. Bill got so angry at the rejection, he attempted to run the boy over. Both boys reported these attacks, and this boy had Bonin's license plate. October 10th, he was arrested, and in December, he was sent back to prison for 1 to 15 years for these horrific attacks. However, because he was a good prisoner and took some math classes, he was released after serving less than 2 years. So I just want to call out that at this point, we're noticing a pattern not only of Bill Bonin here, where he picks up young kids, hitchhikers, kids out on the street by themselves, like teenage boys, and then asks them scary questions and then attacks them. But we're also noticing a little bit of a pattern with the justice system, where they continually release this man. They continually underestimate him. Even when their own doctors are saying he's incurable, he is a problem, they are continuing to just let him out and let him go back into the world and escalate his behavior. And they did it again here. So in November 1978, he moved into an apartment about a mile from his parents' house. He had a neighbor there, 43-year-old Everett Frazier. He was a gay man who had frequent parties at his house that were filled with young men. And it was here that Bill met either all of his accomplices or all but one of his accomplices, which is interesting to me. Like, how do all these people hang out together? All these people who are willing to like rape and kill children are all just hanging out at the same party. Very, very strange. One of these men was 21-year-old Vernon Butts, yes, with 2 T's, and it's a name he deserves. Bonin was in his early 30s at this point, so definitely hanging out with younger guys for sure, which really, makes sense for kind of his MO. And he also, around this time, met 17-year-old Gregory Miley, who it was later found had an IQ of around 56. Now, for reference, this is classified as a mental delay, which means he's likely very easily influenced and controlled, which is perfect for Bill Bonin. He loves a weak follower. Gregory, for his part, saw Bonin as a father figure, but they also had a consensual sexual relationship as well. So that's really fucking twisted, but right on par. Vernon Butts was a drifter who had had a lot of family trauma early on. His father died when he was only 9 years old, and from there he just had a pretty rough life. He had an extensive criminal record and also identified as bisexual. He also had an extensive record of mental illness, and people who knew him noted he was, quote, easily led. So again, there you go. 2 guys that are perfect for Bonin. He's going to control them. He's going to show off for them. He's got all the power. He's got his audience. Now we are going to get into the murders, which are extremely violent and graphic. So if that's not for you, it's time to come back in a week or 2 because I think this is going to be 2 episodes. Here we go. Now, at the time the murders started, he was either a plumber or a delivery driver at this time, and then Bonin later became a truck driver. In any case, around this time, he bought a green Ford Econoline van and modified it to be a straight-up murder mobile. He removed the handles from all of the back doors. He had a number of horrific tools and weapons in his van. So basically, nobody could get out, and anytime he wanted to torture or murder someone, he would have things at the ready. As far as his MO is concerned, his victims were all, or almost all, teenaged, and he mainly went for people who were hitchhiking, who were sex workers, and sometimes he would even just go for random people on the streets, which is a much bigger risk, but I think in those instances, he just really liked the rush. So now we're in early or mid, 1979. He's released from prison at the end of 1978, and by May of 1979, we're getting into it. At this point, I think he should have been in prison for life. I mean, he has a fucking laundry list of like similar sexual assaults, each one escalating from the last, but police only care about property crime. So there you go. His first victim was Thomas Glenn Lundgren, who was only 13 years old when he was abducted on May 28th, 1979. He actually intentionally chose to hitch a ride with Bonin in the green van, and Vernon Butts was present during this murder. Thomas told a friend he was going to meet a guy at a skate park to take photos of him for a skate magazine, but obviously never made it because instead he met Bonin. This one, all of the murders are rough, but this one feels really rough to me because I found pictures of him. And he looks like somebody that I would hang out with. So it just feels a little more personal. I don't know. I'm sure that's silly. All of these murders are terrible. But he honestly looks like a kid that I was friends with or would have had a crush on. And I was my brother was a skater. So when I read this about him, it made me really sad. So he gets in the van with Bonin. And, I think basically it's kind of the same thing that's going to happen every single time. They ask him the leading and scary questions because, Bonin liked to strike fear into his victims, and then he attacked him. When he attacked him, he raped him brutally, then stabbed him multiple times, but not in a way that would kill him, just in a way to hurt him, to torture him. And the most insane part of this story in particular is that they cut off his genitals, possibly while he was still alive. They then strangled this poor 13-year-old boy to death, while Vernon Butts hit him over the head with a heavy object, likely a tire iron. Thomas was found later that day, his body dumped in a field with his clothing and genitals nearby, thrown away like garbage. His next victim, we're just going to get right into it, was 17-year-old Mark Shelton, who agreed to exchange sex for money with Bill and Vernon. Now, this last one was May 28th. It was his first murder, so I think there was a bit of a cooling off period. But Mark Shelton was killed on August 4th. It said that Mark consensually engaged in oral sex with Bill, but was then attacked and tortured so extensively that he actually died of shock. He was raped by at least Bonin, maybe also Vernon Butts, and was also raped with objects, including a stick. Now, this absolute trauma to his body sent him into a state of shock from which he died. So that's how extensive and horrible the torture is, and this is only the second murder. And as I've mentioned, he escalates, and he continues to escalate. So we are all in for a pretty rough ride here. The very next, I'm so sorry. They threw his body out of the car. They just chucked it out of the car on the side of the road after he died because they were upset that they didn't get to kill him the way they wanted to. They also decided that they were not satiated. So the very next day, August 5th, they picked up 17-year-old Marcus Graves, I'm not sure. I should note that between the first murder of Thomas Lundgren and these two murders, Bonin was arrested for rape yet again, but due to a paperwork error was released before his court date and just never showed up. So he was released from jail before he had to face the judge, and he just chose not to, and they just left it at that. So that's awesome. Anyway, Marcus was a 17-year-old German boy who was visiting California, backpacking, kind of just having one last hurrah before going into adulthood, which is super fucking sad. He had allegedly agreed to being tied up by Bonin and Butts when he got into the car. I mean, this is what Bill Bonin says, so who fucking knows? But the fact that he was tied up just shows that Bonin has this need to do that stemming from childhood, as we had talked about before. So once again, it's supposedly a consensual encounter, or starts as such, but he's tied up and Bonin then starts threatening him with a knife. He's then raped and tortured in the van, then taken to Bill's mother's home. Because of course, Bill lives with his mom again, with his parents. He can't hack it on his own for more than a month or so. So they take him back to the house and they torture him more. And at one point, Marcus was able to break free, and he actually punched Bill in the face, and this sent him into a frenzy. He ended up stabbing Marcus 77 times before strangling him to death. And I did want to note, the way that Bill Bonin liked to strangle his victims was by using their own t-shirts and tying them around their neck, and then using a tire iron to twist the t-shirt until it was so tight that his victims died. So it was really horrific, and it kind of adds to, he's a very much like an insult to injury kind of killer, where he really wants the people to suffer because he's just a horrible piece of shit. And I feel like this way of using their own clothing to kill them is very on par. It's very on brand for this motherfucker. After he was dead, his body was dumped in Malibu, just along the side of the road, which is, again, very insulting and very on brand. Now, during this time, Bill Bonin wasn't just murdering people. As I noted, he was also actively molesting and raping local boys. Neighbors said they would see the young boys accompany him to his home, which he, again, shared with his parents. And then neighbors would hear screaming and crying. And we all know what that means. And also, if the neighbors are hearing this, what are his parents hearing? Especially since his dad was disabled and at home all the time, didn't work, didn't leave the house really. Obviously, he was doing this with the at least one parent's knowledge, which is beyond twisted, but again, kind of makes sense. And that's just me guessing, but it just makes sense. If dad's home all the time and neighbors know this is happening, they know. They've got to know. Anyway, so there could be a lot more victims than we know about. One of the reasons that this is thought, because it is widely suggested that he maybe killed more than we think, is because after he was arrested for raping that young boy, where the paperwork mishap and he got out before his court date, he told his neighbor Frazier that he was going to make sure there would never be a witness to testify against him again. Which is interesting because later when they're talking about this guy, this neighbor, he was saying, oh, I had no idea that he was doing this. And it's like, he made it pretty fucking clear. Like, he told you, I'm going to keep raping boys and I'm going to make sure they're not around to testify against me. So I feel like there was a lot of opportunity for this guy to be stopped or caught. And it was just the inaction of literally everybody around him that kept him able to keep murdering and being a piece of shit. His next victim was 18-year-old Robert Wirostek, who was picked up in Huntington Beach on August 20th. So like barely 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks, I guess, after the last murder, or just over 2 weeks. Yeah, 15 days. And he was picked up while riding his bike to his job at a grocery store. It's unclear if he went into the van of his own volition or if he was forced with a gun or other threat. But once inside the van, it was much the same thing as it was with Marcus. Rape, torture that was mental, physical, and sexual, and then being strangled to death and dumped. Now, very sadly, Robert had another sibling, a brother, who died only 5 years later at age 21. I do not know what his cause of death was. I do believe he was in trouble a little bit, and I would go out on a limb and say that it definitely could have had something to do with his brother's murder. Anyway, 7 days later, August 27th, Bonin and Butts picked up 15-year-old Donald Ray Hayden. Now, Donald had lived in the LA area for only around 2 years after his parents had divorced, and his mother, brother, and sister moved to California from Cincinnati, Ohio. Donald, to that point, had had a pretty decent childhood, but after the divorce, he just took it really hard. He had a really hard time dealing with his parents' divorce, and he would run away from his mother's home from time to time, and sometimes was even sent to live with his grandparents. However, more recently, he had finally realized how much he missed his mom and siblings, so he decided to move back in with them full time. And so they all lived in the Santa Monica area down near the beach in Los Angeles. He was last seen in Hollywood the night of his abduction, and it's thought he was hitchhiking home when he was picked up by Bonin and Butts. He was raped, tortured, beaten, and strangled with a ligature that had also been tied around his ankles and wrists. So this time it wasn't the t-shirt, it was like a cord that strangled him. He was then dumped at a construction site on the 101 freeway. And this is super rough, so trigger warning if you haven't already been feeling that. The coroner, after seeing his body, said that his rectum was so distended that it looked as though he had been impaled with something. It was later noted that he had likely been assaulted with a fist. So the torture of this 15-year-old boy was very much next level. Bonin's accomplices would later all say that the more pain his victims were in and the more they screamed and the more scared they were, the happier Bill became, which makes sense. You know, it seemed obviously par for the course again. He fed off their pain and fear and misery, which is just truly fucking psychotic. His next victim was 17-year-old David Louis Murillo. He was riding his bike to a movie, somehow ended up in the van, and unfortunately met with a similar fate to the other boys to that point. His head, in addition to all of the beatings, had been bashed in with a tire iron, and he was strangled to death. So again, similar, but a little worse on the beatings. The next victim, who was killed on or around November 1st, 1979, is to this day unidentified, which makes me very sad that no one ever claimed his body, but it aligns with the type of people that Bonin would target. It is believed he's between the ages of 18 and 24, so maybe a little bit older than some of the other victims, but also that's just a guess since they don't know. So he could definitely still be a teenager. On top of all the other torture, Bonin, who must have talked with him a bit and found out he was a runaway, during the murder told this unidentified boy that his parents had paid Bonin and Butts to find him and kill him. So on top of raping, torturing, and killing him, they were also like mentally torturing him, really trying to like fuck with him and just make him, you know, as scared and as sad and miserable as possible, which is disgusting. After he was dead, luckily, Bonin tried a new weapon on him. He stuck an ice pick into his head. This will come into play later, maybe not always when the victims are dead, unfortunately. November 30th, they killed 17-year-old Frank Dennis Fox, who had a checkered past, but wasn't, like, everybody who knew him was like, he wasn't a bad kid at all. He was just really smart and really bored. So he would get into trouble because he just didn't know what else to do with himself. Dennis, as he was called, was reading and writing by 4 years old and never had to study a day of his life to get good grades. He also had some behavioral issues, including getting kicked out of Catholic school at only 5 years old for sneaking out and ringing the bell in the bell tower. Like I said, his younger brother said, he's just bored. He needs something to stay busy. At the time of his death, he was already living on his own, using money from his father's untimely death the year prior to pay for an apartment for himself while he figured out what he wanted to do. People who knew him said he could talk his way out of almost anything. He was very charming, but very sadly, he could not talk his way out of Bill Bonin's van. I read too much about him, and now I really don't want to get into his death because he just seems like such a great kid. But I will say that the torture was being ramped up at this time with more use of the ice pick and burning of the skin with cigarettes, which is horrible. Dennis's body was found on the Ortega Highway just 2 days after he was murdered. The next victim, killed on December 12th, 1979, was 15-year-old John Kilpatrick. He, according to Bonin, took money for sex. And I did read that he was kind of like a runaway and doing what he had to kind of, make ends meet. I find it interesting how many of these victims, Bonin said, like, got into the car willingly, engaged in sex willingly. But at the same time, he has no remorse. So he never seems to, like, lie about what happened because I don't think he gives a shit. When he gets caught, he's kind of like, yeah, I did it. Here's the details. Couldn't care less. So I don't know. But I just want to call out, like, I hate that so much of this about these children is being presented like, oh, they were willing sex workers. And it's like, children cannot be willing sex workers. Like, that's not a thing. They were desperate victims of violence in the world, of bad homes, So just want to call that out. Anyway, he was violently raped. Again, John agreed to having sex with him, John Kilpatrick, but only oral. And then when Bill tried to tried to have sex with him, he said something along the lines of, I don't get fucked. So you can imagine that Bonin would love to overpower this kid who said that because he's such a sadistic piece of shit. So definitely raped him, again, very much against his will, and then murdered him. His body was dumped near Rialto, and because he had a history of running away, he was not reported missing until February, so a couple of months later, and was a John Doe when he was found. It took 2 tattoos on his body for his family to identify him. His next victim was 16-year-old Michael Francis McDonald, another troubled teen who he lured into his van with the promise of drugs, telling him you can sell these drugs for money. Weirdly, his body was found fully clothed, and it took until March 24th to identify his body. Also weirdly, and maybe connected to the fully clothed thing, this was one of Bonin's only solo murders. So he did this without any of his little cronies there to watch. Which is why maybe it wasn't necessarily less brutal, but definitely a very different type of killing. And I think the reason he didn't have anybody there is because Vernon Butts was kind of trying to get away from him. Like, Vernon was like, I don't really like this. So he was trying to kind of distance himself. But I think he was always also afraid of Bonin. So he was trying to be careful about it. Now, I want to say at this point, police have not put together that there is a serial killer out there, which is absolutely fucking bonkers considering there were more than one in this area at this time. There was literally another freeway killer, Randy Kraft, killing at this time, as well as Bonin. So not only are there multiple serial killers, there are multiple serial killers called the freeway killer. And cops are just like, nope, no serial killer. These are not linked. And they're so obviously linked. The t-shirt strangulation, the same type of ligatures being used, the rape, the torture. I mean, it's obvious that these are linked, but cops, I think, and many agree that they ignored the obvious in order to not have the pressure of having to solve a serial killer case, which, like, I don't know, too fucking bad, like, sorry, there's more pressure for you to do your job. Fucking do your job. But they didn't want the public in a panic was their excuse, but I don't really buy it. It's really disappointing also that they didn't come out with this information because it could have saved some lives. as could have keeping Bonin in prison when he was supposed to be in there. But, multiple paperwork errors, miscommunications, all of this. I mean, it's just the way things went, I guess. I don't know. All that said, he was free and did continue his spree. On February 3rd, 1980, he wants to kill again, and Butts is not around. So this time he takes 17-year-old Gregory Miley with him. The two went out cruising for a murder victim and found 15-year-old Charles Miranda, I can't say that name, hitchhiking outside of the Starwood Club. Now, if you've listened to my previous episodes, of which there are a whopping 4, you might remember the name Starwood Club, as it was the punk club owned by Eddie Nash, who in about a year's time from when this takes place would mass murder 4 people in a revenge killing over a robbery in his home. If you want to know more, it's the Wonderland Murders episode. You can go listen to it when you're done here. Anyway, this poor kid Charles was outside the club and was, of course, picked up by Bonin and Miley. At first, they only robbed him of the $6 he had, but then they started with the rape and torture. Miley attempted to rape Charles as well, but was not able to stay erect. And because this embarrassed him, he instead raped him with sharp objects in the van while the poor boy screamed and cried in pain and fear. Eventually, Charles was so injured that Bonin said to Miley, "The kid's gonna die. He's gonna die." Miley said they should just let him go, but Bonin already knew that wasn't gonna happen. He told Miley no because the kid could identify them, but in reality, it's more likely because he enjoyed killing children and had no intention of ever letting him go. But I think he was maybe trying to sort of ease Miley into the murders and not scare him off. Obviously, that didn't end up being an issue, as Miley got so into it that while Bonin showed him how to strangle Charles using the t-shirt and tire iron method, Miley took to jumping up and down on his chest until he died from strangulation and also trauma. Again, he was 15 years old. They dumped his body in an alleyway in downtown Los Angeles and immediately, like not even 5 minutes later, went looking for another victim. This is another especially horrific one, as this poor child was only 12 years old and was picked up while waiting at a bus stop to go to Disneyland for the day. So they started looking for this guy, this new victim, at like 2 a.m. They didn't find him till the next morning, kind of early. Now, this victim was staying with his older brother while his parents were out of town, and it wasn't uncommon for kids his age to ride the bus to places like Disneyland and go to Disneyland on their own. Hence, I dare say, the age of serial killers. It was easier to find a victim back then. This boy's name was James McCabe, and he went willingly into the van thinking he was getting a ride instead of having to wait for the bus. He was raped repeatedly over several hours while also being beaten, and after Bonin was done with him, Miley joined in and they strangled him to death with his t-shirt and the tire iron. They then dumped his nude body next to a dumpster. Bonin later said he was, quote, the easiest one to kill of all his victims. Which, fuck you. Fuck you, you disgusting maggot. I just hate this man so much. Very luckily, right after this time, Bonin was arrested on a parole violation and spent some time in jail, about like a month or 2. Not a long time, but with how quickly he was killing, this time away likely saved some lives. He was released in March, and his reign of terror continued. But I'm going to save that for next week, because we have to stop somewhere, and I felt like this was a good breaking point. He's back in prison, even if for a short while, and this will be a good time to take a little mental break from the insanity of this case, and we can come back to it next week and finish it up. Hope you guys were able to hang in there. This was real rough, real gnarly, and there's more to come. I hate to say it, but he's got some time left, and with the rate at which he's going, we've got some more people to talk about. So thanks everybody for listening, for hanging in there. My first 2-parter, I'm pretty excited. Hopefully you guys are enjoying, if for lack of a better word. And please like, rate, review, share with your friends, share with everybody. I'm still posting on my old podcast platform just so that people get an opportunity to listen, but really trying to grow this one. So if you guys can follow me, listen, like, rate, review, share with your friends, share on your social media, whatever it is, it's all very appreciated. Thanks again for tuning in. I'll be back next week. And until then, everybody stay safe. God damn.